Hello, my name is Manaswini Pochmareddy, and I will be presenting about the accessibility of modern poetry. First off, what is poetry? Poetry, to me, is this collection of artistically told stories that bring out raw emotions. Like, many, including myself, are inspired by poetry, and it usually has a greater meaning or moral. The accessibility of poetry is how easy it is to understand. For example, modern simple poetry would have easy accessibility as it is more adapted to our current society. But works written in the 17th century, for instance, would have difficult accessibility as we are not really used to that type of writing, so it's harder to understand the meaning behind it. There can be crossovers where modern poetry might be difficult to understand and older poetry would be easier to understand. It all depends on the language that the author uses and how we interpret that language and how easy it is for us to interpret that language. So the audience and the community have a huge role in determining the accessibility of a poem. So I believe the target audience is what determines it, actually. So based on who the author is trying to write the poem to, or who he believes is going to be reading his poem in the future, is how he determines what level of accessibility to use. So when he writes it, he knows who the poem is aimed towards, right? And he knows who will be most likely reading that poem. Based on that, the author changes the accessibility. Typically, if an author wants more people to easily understand the meaning behind that poem, then he or she will use colloquial language or choose an easier accessibility so that more people can truly grasp it and understand it. And if they want less people or maybe more people with experience in poetry to really look for the hidden meaning behind a poem, then he will use a higher level of accessibility and make it more so that the meaning of the poem is disguised in the language of the poem. Typically, for me, I prefer an easily accessible poem as it is more enjoyable to me and I can really truly understand the meaning behind that poem, so it's just easier for me to grasp that way. The first example I have is the well-known poem The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. So this poem talks about the choices that could have been taken, essentially. In a forest, the speaker is traveling through, he comes across two roads and he chooses one over the other. And he is basically wondering what would have happened if I took this road or if I didn't take this road. How big of a role do our choices make in our lives? So it's fairly simple to understand this poem because the roads clearly represent the different paths that we could have taken in our lives and the choices that we make. The author tries to convey how we don't know what could have happened and how our life would have been different if we made a choice different than the one that we ended up making. So it's all about choices and how we actually don't know the impact that a choice that we take might actually have. This poem has more modern language and doesn't use overly eloquent words so that a reader can easily understand it, making it have an easy accessibility. The next example I have is also another pretty well-known poem called All I Have to Bring Today by Emily Dickinson. She's a pretty famous author, but I feel like she's more modern than some of the other authors I have here. And she was part of the Romantic era, so this had a focus on nature. This poem describes what the speaker is bringing with herself to God, essentially. She talks about all the aspects of nature that she can bring with her. She's essentially showing what she has to offer, I guess. And she's basically talking about how her heart is true and she would be willing to give it to God, along with all the nature that she has around her. The emphasis on nature is mostly due to the fact that this is a romantic period, right? So, and that's what the main focus was about. But also, she describes her devotion and how everything that she has was given by God. So she would bring it with her. She's talking about how since he gave her all of this, including her true heart and all that nature, she has protected it and cared for it, making sure that it stays vibrant and true. She also talks about how she would be willing to give it back to him, and that's what Emily's trying to say. And this poem would have an easy accessibility as it again uses modern language and simple phrases with some rhetorical language that is fairly easy to understand. It's just talking about what the speaker has to offer, and so more people would be able to understand this poem and the meaning behind it. The next example is The Colonel by Carolyn Forche. This poem describes how the speaker is a witness in a case where the colonel is a victim. So the theme of this poem is primarily injustice and how the people of this city or country were being treated unfairly. So this poem was a lot harder for me to understand and took me several reads. For example, there's this line in the poem where the speaker pours out a bag of human ears, and when I first read this poem, I didn't understand the significance of these ears and what they represent. But after several reads, I realized they actually represent and are a symbol of the cruelty and unjust treatment that is described in the poem. So the author was trying to convey how the speaker actually cut off the ears of many people in order to account for the unjust treatment that he felt had been going on in that country. But in reality, the colonel is expected to protect the people but not cut off their ears and mistreat them. So it was supposed to show the irony. But until I read this poem multiple times, I didn't even grasp that idea. This is due to the language of the poem, and also not really the language actually, but just more of how the story was set. You had to really read into why the colonel was doing what he was doing, and it wasn't simple to understand, even though the language was a modern language. So there was more symbolism in this that wasn't really apparent at first, but after multiple reads you would grasp it, and just the description and realizing why certain details were important in comparison to others made this have a higher accessibility level than the previous poems. This last example is Sonnet 73 by Shakespeare. Well, right from the start, you can see that this poem presented its own challenges, as it was much more difficult to understand because of the language. The language that it was written in was suitable for the time period, but now in our society, this manner of speaking doesn't really exist. The main idea of this poem is to describe how the speaker's age is represented by this season and time. So the speaker draws examples from the nature around him to show how his old age is reflected in the nature. So, for example, when he says, when he talks about the leaves falling off and the trees shaking in the cold, that's how he's talking about his old age in the autumn, and the weather has become cold and there's nothing really left, just what he thinks is him. And when I read this poem for the first time, it was very difficult because I didn't really understand what he was trying to symbolize. But after trying to read it multiple times, he talked about how he was going to pass away and he just wanted to express to his love that he would be leaving soon, and it was a symbol of the nature, or this nature symbolized that he would be too. So since this poem was a lot harder to understand, it means that it had a higher accessibility because it took multiple reads, and it was much more, the language and the symbolism was just a lot more difficult than some of the other poems. Overall, all these poems were aimed towards different target audiences. The change in audience is what created the change in accessibility, and if the audience is more young and still new to poetry, it would be better to have poems with easier accessibility so that the reader could understand them better. But if the reader is more experienced, they might enjoy a more difficult read to really find the hidden meaning behind the poem. And overall, like, the role of accessibility in modern poetry is very important because depending on the audience, you need to be able to adjust the accessibility so that who you're aiming the poem towards can really understand what is going on and what you're trying to say and like what impact you're trying to have. Thank you.